Hello. Good afternoon. Yesterday I left you in 2014 with the Russian occupation of the Crimea by military forces that had been stationed there already at the naval bases of Sevastopol, and then branched out and used the confusion in Kiev during the Euromaidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, to take over the peninsula of the Crimea, and then during the summer of 2014 to also stir up a rebellion in the Donbas area. So since then, we are looking at Ukraine as partly occupied. Today, I want to continue with the war that is raging since 2022. And I'm not starting with Putin, but I'm starting with Zelensky. The president of Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, he's the 6th president of Ukraine. Number 6 means there is a lively democratic landscape in Ukraine. There is not one or two presidents like Putin, who has been in power since 2000 as president and prime minister, but there is a changing sequence of presidents who come from different parties, different areas of the country, and who usually represent either a pro-Russian or a pro-European course, but at the same time, even a pro-European president has to take consideration of Russian interests and of the interests of people in eastern Ukraine. Zelensky is special because he came to power after being a comedian. And the sequence, the series that brought him to popularity is called Servant of the People. And that's something you can probably watch on YouTube or on Netflix. It is about a school teacher who is not corrupt and who is very humane, but at the same time also disciplined towards his students. And his students love him. And they see in him the perfect politician. And then they promote him to run for president. And then he wins. He wins the elections. So that's the series of Servant of the People. And later, Zelensky himself created a party, Servant of the People, and ran for president and won against the sitting regime, against the elite. He is popular, not a populist in the sense that I explained to you as being anti-elite and very much manipulating, but somebody who plays with the idea of authenticity, of being real and not being a representative of oligarchs and of politicians from the security sector and of criminals. So he came with an agenda not of fighting a war against Russia, but with an agenda of bringing Ukraine together and of democratizing Ukraine and fighting corruption. And fighting corruption is possible with the help of the European Union, but not with the help of the Russian Federation that is using corruption in order to undermine the nation of Ukraine. So with other words, the trajectory brought him closer to the West, and this is also why he has been elected and why he came into conflict with with Russia. The argument that I'm proposing here is that for Russia, democracy is a threat. Zelensky was a threat, and Putin hated him from the very beginning. He didn't take him serious. And obviously this led also to the miscalculation of the war that Putin started, the full-scale war, in 22. In December 21, Putin made a proposal to the US President Biden. He sent him a text and that said, NATO should not expand to the east. NATO should not have forces in the territories that were taken into territory of NATO since the 1990s. And that in effect means that NATO should withdraw from Poland, the Baltic states, and Hungary, for instance, and that Ukraine should never be part of NATO. So that's the most important thing. And then please sign at the dotted line. This text was published by the Kremlin, and it was published as a treaty between Russia and the United States. Over the heads of NATO, it was not a treaty between Russia and NATO. Over the heads of the Europeans, who were not involved at all, and over the heads of Ukraine, it was a decision between the great power of Russia and the great power of the United States. The United States did not take that seriously and understood that this is a provocation and not a serious attempt at having a conversation about Ukraine. With other words, the proposal was rejected. It was rejected because it didn't come as an invitation for negotiation, but it came as a ready-made document that you either accept or not, and we didn't accept that. It would be a capitulation not only before the Ukrainians, but also before Eastern Europe, before those countries that joined the European Union and NATO since the 1990s. So this was the kind of diplomatic offer that Putin made at that point. Either you give me what I want right now, or I will invade Ukraine. At the same time, by December 21, when this text was published, it was already clear that hundreds of thousands of Russian troops were stationed around Ukraine, all around Ukraine. In the north, partly on Belarusian territory as well. In the east, where Russian troops were already fighting in the Donbass against Ukrainian troops. In the south, in the Crimean Peninsula, occupied by Russia since 2014. And also in the very south, namely in the Black Sea, where Russia had this big Black Sea military fleet. The Navy was there. On 24th February, he announced on TV that there is a special military operation targeted at eliminating the Nazi regime in Ukraine and saving the Russians in Ukraine from genocide. I already mentioned that these are blatant lies. There was no genocide going on. Nobody was being hurt. There were laws about the status of the Russian language to be second below the rank of Ukrainian as the national language of Ukraine. But this is a pretty normal kind of using the national language and preferring it over other languages, especially if it's the language of your mighty neighbor. So he was taking these fake facts in order to construct a narrative about why Ukraine needs to be liberated. And obviously the idea was to quickly move into Ukraine, to use these Donetsk areas here that he first recognized as independent states and later on annexed. So the same kind of scenario that we saw for the Crimea. First, you help them get their independence, and then immediately, a couple of weeks later, you take that independence away by integrating them into the Russian Federation. The full-scale attack was on various places, and it was targeting Kiev in the first place. So huge columns of Russian tanks and trucks were moving from Belarus south towards Kiev. Paratroopers had been sent to the vicinity of Kiev to obviously take the airport where you might have remembered the biggest airplane in the world was stationed, the Mriya, the Ukrainian freight aircraft that was sometimes hired for transporting aircraft. And these were all destroyed. The troops came in, obviously expecting that there would not be any kind of serious resistance, that the Ukrainians would be simply giving in. And this is a serious underestimation of the way how the Ukrainians have been trained since 2014, how they have been disciplined, how the army has been restructured, and also of the will of the Ukrainians, irrespective of whether Russian is their native language or Ukrainian or Hungarian. There are also Hungarian minorities in the country, Romanian minorities, to defend themselves. The Russians make big advances in the first week, but then they get stuck, and in the end, by March, they have to go and leave territories that they already won. On the map, you see the blue territories that were occupied by the Russians in this first wave of attack, but then they had to relinquish this territory because the Ukrainians fought back. During this time, our discourse was completely focused on the idea that we could punish Putin by economic sanctions and by punishing the economy of the Russian Federation. This is a list showing you the countries, or the numbers of countries who voted at the United Nations General Assembly for or against the war. The motion was to accuse Russia of having violated Ukraine, and you see that from the 193 member states, the majority, 141, supported the motion that identified Russia as the aggressor and not Russia as the victim, as Putin described Russia. But you also see that there is a group of 35 who abstained, and these are important. These are countries, on the one hand, that are the global south, and for the global south this war is far away, and for the global south it doesn't really matter what is Ukraine and what is Russia. For the global south, their priorities are different. But among these who abstained, you also find countries like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Tajikistan. Now, what does this tell us? Russia's security architecture is built on alliances with these countries. Russia's economic union, the Eurasian Union, includes these countries. With other words, even these countries like Kazakhstan or Armenia, or that is the closest allies that Russia has in the post-Soviet era, the post-Soviet area, did not support the Russian vision of this war. Obviously, Kazakhstan is a country adjacent to Russia, with huge Russian-speaking minorities, would be very hesitant to support Putin's attack on Ukraine, fearing that the same could happen also to Kazakhstan. Putin has been constructing images of Ukraine as an artificial state, a product of the Western powers who created Ukraine, a product of Stalin and Lenin who artificially put Russian territories together in order to feed Ukraine. But he also made the similar statements about Kazakhstan, that was also a construct of the Soviet Union, of Lenin and Stalin, setting Kazakh territories together and giving Kazakhstan territories that had been settled by Russians and by Slavic settlers, including Ukrainians, in the 19th and 20th centuries. With other words, for a country like Kazakhstan, Ukraine could simply be the kind of precursor of an attack that, or at least pressure that Russia would yield against Kazakhstan. And you see the 5 countries that voted against. And that is not China. That is Russia and Belarus, of course, in the first place, but then North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria, client states of Russia at that point. This is the General Assembly where all nations of the United Nations are assembled and all have one vote. And then there is also the UN Security Council, which has the permanent members plus rotating members. The permanent members being the victory nations of the Second World War, including China. And here, of course, you didn't get an agreement because China and Russia vetoed a kind of identification of Russia as the aggressor in this war. This is another narrative line about the lack of functionality of the United Nations, something that also bears much importance for questions about international law, about rights of sovereignty of states. If the United Nations is not in a position to reach unanimity because it is so divided, does it still serve its function? And there, of course, scholars of international law would tell you that with all of the deficiencies of the United Nations, the General Assembly still gives you a pretty clear idea of what is right and what is wrong. The next step, Russia's annexation of these areas of Ukraine, regions of Ukraine that it partly occupied, is curious insofar as it was an annexation of the areas in the borders of the territories that they were in Ukraine. That is, the kind of administrative districts were annexed. But at that time, when Putin did that, Russia did not have command over these territories yet. It only occupied parts of it. With other words, Russia annexed territories that it didn't have under its own control, including huge parts of the Zaporizhia district and of the Kherson district. But even the Donbas area was not fully under control. 22, so this very quick moving of the front line ended in stalemate. So Russia reached a certain area, but from then on it was very slow in moving forward, in getting more foothold on territory of Ukraine. The big war center at one point was Mariupol, the port city in the south. When that fell, basically the front line remained as it still is today. Russia is making advances, but these advances are a few kilometers since then. And it lost cities like Kherson again. There was one episode in this war that tells us a lot about two things, about Putin's regime and about what happens to a state if it's run by an autocrat, by an authoritarian leader. Putin's regime is based on personal loyalties by individuals. And these are usually the people with whom he worked in St. Petersburg, from where he is, where he started his career as a KGB officer, where he later worked in the city administration in the early 1990s, and where he used his old contacts with the security apparatus, with the FSB, the Federal Service of Intelligence, of Security, and when he became president, he used these people for stuffing his ministries. With other words, around him you have a clique of old acquaintances from St. Petersburg, and then, of course, younger people who, under the patronage of Putin, grew up in the system and became ministers or generals or whatnot. One of these figures is Prigozhin. Prigozhin started his career in Putin's entourage as his cook, but then developed a restaurant chain, became rich by the Kremlin connections, and a military company, a private military company. A private military company is a very awkward kind of construction. It means that there is a military at your disposal that you buy, the services of which you pay for, but where you can always reject responsibility. According to the Russian state law, private military companies are outlawed in Russia. There's a ban on these companies. The US has them as well. There are lots of these companies all over the world. In Russia, they are forbidden, and still they're thriving. Because Russia needs them, the Kremlin needs them to do the dirty jobs elsewhere in the world, including in Africa. Maduro's entourage, his bodyguards at one point were a Russian military company. And through these military companies, you get influence in other countries. So they were designed in the first place as a kind of instrument for influencing leaders abroad, namely for bringing Russian military aid to countries where the Russian army should better not be involved directly, because it's too costly and because the army is responsible to the mothers of the soldiers and to the publicity that they might get. Private military companies work in obscurity, in the shadow, and that means they can also bear huge losses because the people are contract soldiers and they are being paid for that. So he used these private military companies in Syria, for instance, for shock troopers against the Islamic State and against the opposition of the Syrian regime that Putin wanted to maintain in power. But then he used it also in the war in Ukraine. Well, the Wagner group that I'm talking about suffered severe casualties in this war of attrition, especially around the area of Bakhmut. And then it came to a kind of duel between Prigozhin and the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, so the regular minister, the minister in Putin's government. The government and the Ministry of Defense were in charge of supplying ammunition to the private military company Wagner. But when the ammunition ran out, Prigozhin, as the leader of Wagner, demanded that the remaining ammunition be sent to him. So he was constantly shouting at Shoigu, at the Minister of Defense, "Give me the ammunition. My people here are dying like flies in being shelled by the Ukrainian artillery, and I don't have anything to fight with." So what we see is a duel between the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, who is in control of the supply lines, and Prigozhin, who is basically competing with the original Minister of Defense, who is in charge of the army. A kind of competition between the private military company and the army. And this is a conflict that escalated. Eventually, Prigozhin took some of his trucks and men and tried to march from the front line to Moscow. So they made a convoy and drove to Moscow. He didn't say, "I want to depose Putin," but he obviously wanted to escalate the conflict to outdo the Minister of Defense. Maybe to become Minister of Defense himself, or at least to get more money and more ammunition for his own troops, or simply out of his ego. At any event, he was stopped, or he stopped himself. He was not stopped by the regular army of the Russian Federation. He was stopped, obviously, because he understood that he cannot do that anymore. And Putin obviously took back his cover for him. He relinquished the kind of parapluie, the kind of umbrella, the kind of protection that he gave to Prigozhin when he was his cook and when he was his military fighter in Ukraine. At that point, there was a deal. Prigozhin went into the shadow for a while. The Wagner group was dismantled and put under the Ministry of Defense. And later on, Prigozhin died under very curious circumstances, most probably being shot down by a Russian missile. What this tells us is that Putin's regime is weak because it is built on the competition between various ministries, that is the institutions of the constitutional state, and parastatal organizations that he sets up himself, that Putin creates. There is an extra army that is supposed to be in competition with the real army. And Putin is the kind of arbiter that is balancing between the regular army and the private army, that decides about the money flows to this or to that guy. In the end, it all depends on the personal network of Putin, because he's putting his own cronies in place, the people whom he can rely on. And if somebody does not turn out to be reliable anymore, like Prigozhin, he's being eliminated. Since that time, since these spectacular moves, we have a war of attrition which is largely fought by drones. Drone warfare is atrocious. I just had a talk to, where's our student from Brazil? Hey, you were in Ukraine 2 years ago, you said? Can I mention that? Yeah. And what are drones like?
Drones are very loud. Nobody can sleep while they're meanwhile. You never know if the drone is like a watching drone, if it's a kamikaze drone, so everyone just stays scared. So sometimes the basilical missiles were less scary because you have the air defense, but the drones, they are...
So you don't know what the drone is doing, whether it's loitering ammunition that is flying around and at one point it's being ordered to fall down on the target. It can be a reconnaissance drone, it's there all the time, you hear it, you don't see it, and obviously you have very limited means to take it down. There is an arms race in the drone and anti-drone warfare production since then going on. And obviously the Ukrainians by now are very good experts in drone warfare, because since then they have been swarmed with drones, which were largely first in the beginning produced by Iran. So we have Iranian drones, the Shahid drones, that were then produced in license in Russia, and that became more and more sophisticated to not be shot down. But the Ukrainians also developed their anti-drone missiles and try to protect their infrastructure. The war has turned into a war of attrition, not just bombing the military infrastructure, but also, especially in wintertime, the heating systems and the electricity stations, the power stations. Since that time, the West has largely supported Ukraine, and Ukraine is calling for more support in anti-missile drones and anti-missile weapons and anti-drone weapons. From the International Criminal Court in The Hague, at a very early point, came the warrant for Putin. That is, Putin was summoned before the court. Here again, the Netherlands plays a huge role. This is a building in Vilnius that says, hey, Mr. Putin, The Hague is waiting for you. In the beginning, this was very clear. There are violations of human rights, and this needs to be brought before the court. It's very improbable that Putin will be brought before the court unless he's taken out of power. But still, it's an important sign to give that this will be treated after the war. At the same time, also the Trump administration doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court and even put sanctions on it to make life difficult. So that the people who work for also some of my colleagues who work for the Criminal Court are now not getting their salaries via bank accounts, but simply in cash, because no bank is risking to be on the US blacklist, which makes it very difficult for a court to function. What were the Western responses? As I said, there is much diplomatic support, including at the United Nations level. There has been a lot of economic sanctions on Russia. But if you look at the list, they come piecemeal. First, this all develops over time. It took months and years, and we are now with the 20th or so sanctions package of the European Union against Russia, which means every time we add a little bit and we ask ourselves, hey, is there another person whom we should take into consideration for putting sanctions on him, and so forth. An important measure was the roofing of the oil price so that Russia doesn't make too much benefit from selling its oil and gas. This has to do with shipping companies, European shipping and insurance companies that would either be not allowed to insure or to ship Russian oil, so that Russia is circumventing these sanctions by using old and decrepit ships that it buys from other countries in the world. But there has also been a huge, and this must be mentioned, a huge civil society support for Ukraine. 4.3 million refugees came to Europe, came out of Ukraine usually in the first month of the war. These were people from the front line, that is those that had been expelled by the Russian penetration, but also people from areas that now became targeted of Russian bombings. Bombings by missiles, and ballistic missiles go up, and they go into outer space, and they fall back on the ground with an immense velocity. So at that speed, it's very difficult to intercept them. At the beginning, the Ukrainians didn't have any means to shoot them down. The Europeans and the Americans provided them with some of the anti-ballistic missiles, the Patriots, for instance. Cruise missiles that fly below the radar, very difficult to target as well. And they would be expanding the realm of their targets so that the civilian population is suffering from that. The European Union very quickly decided to use the temporary protection instrument. The temporary protection instrument means that Ukrainian refugees would not go through the asylum procedures. People come from Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the world. They would go into asylum centers and from there have a long procedure until their case individually will be adjudicated and whether they have the right to stay and get asylum or whether they have to be brought back. For the Ukrainians, the temporary protection instrument means there is no asylum procedure. You immediately have access to the labor market and to housing. This is an enormous advantage of Ukrainians because it means that they could immediately be settled. In Amsterdam, for instance, the city administration freed a huge housing complex and allowed Ukrainian citizens to live there, and still the case. So that made life easier for Ukrainian refugees, and it also made it cheaper for us because it means they would immediately go into the labor force, at least partially, instead of being on the state's budget. At the same time, most of the refugees that came are women, are mothers with children, and elderly people. Simply because young men and men until the age of 50 or 60 would be remaining in the country and could be called upon to defend Ukraine. And then came the military support. And as I said, it developed over time and very, very sluggishly. In the beginning, we were thinking about Ukraine will collapse like a house of cards, so what should we deliver to Ukraine? Anything we deliver, if that's sophisticated military hardware, it will fall into the hands of the Russians, and we don't want that. But then, as Ukraine proved itself capable of stopping the Russian onslaught, the Western governments gradually increased the range of the military arsenal that they provided to Kiev. In the end, the Dutch again played a leading role in providing fighter jets. The first fighter jets were the F-16 that were no longer used by the Dutch Air Force, so they were sent to Ukraine, still capable of making an impression. At the same time, this is piecemeal and it's not much, and it's and it needs a lot of training and supply lines for each of the instruments that we bring, whether it's an American F-16 or a German tank or a Swedish tank or an American tank. All of these items, as good as they are and as useful as they are, they need their own supply lines and a huge amount of effort in order to keep them running. The most effective things are probably the anti-air defense systems that we brought and that we still supply. Then comes the European Union on the level of policymaking towards Ukraine as a future member state. Ukraine had an association agreement, and this association agreement failure of 2013 was the reason for the regime change in Kiev, for the democratization effort that came under a new president and then under Zelensky. But it was also the reason for the turmoil that Ukraine faced in 2014 and the occupation of the Crimea and the start of the Donbas. The association agreement was introduced after the occupation of the Donbas and Crimea. And during the wartime, Ukraine asked for membership in NATO. But it also asked for membership in the European Union. Obviously, NATO is important to defend Ukraine. The idea being that there would be security guarantees that would make it impossible for Russia to attack Ukraine once more. However, it is very difficult or impossible to include a country into NATO or the European Union as long as this country is at war. For the simple reason that it would mean that all the members of NATO would also be at war with the country that is fighting against this new member. With the European Union, it's in principle the same story, because also the European Union treaties have a common security and defense policy, which means the European Union is not just about trade and legal systems and freedom of capital and people and goods, but it's also about common security and defense initiatives, meaning Ukraine would also be integrated into or being brought up to the level of Western forces and of NATO forces. NATO did not decide to embrace Ukraine. There was a very lukewarm kind of statement in 2008 that at one point in time in the future Ukraine and Georgia would be members of NATO, but since then all major NATO powers, including the US, including Germany, have always warned against any procedure that would lead to Ukraine becoming a part of NATO. Obviously, since 2014, this is with the idea that this would lead to a war with Russia. With other words, by 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was no talk about including Ukraine into NATO. So if we now start this procedure here of trying to bring Ukraine into the European Union, there is a military component attached to that, but at the same time it's clear that all of this will be symbolic unless there is a lasting peace that would allow Ukraine to be member state of Europe. I don't want to bore you with the further events of the war, except that at one point it became clear that the West is constantly shooting itself in the leg by discussing everything online. Russia is doing what it does, and we are talking about things. At one point, Macron, the French president, came with the idea and said, at one point there will be troops, French troops, and yes, why not? This is Macron's public profile. He's very weak at home, and sometimes he tries to compensate that with international prestige that he gains. Here, running ahead and saying it's no longer impossible that there will be French troops in a kind of a package with other troops. And we call this strategic ambiguity, to leave the enemy in the shadow, in the dark, about the real ambitions and the real capabilities of the West. But this would all be conditional of a kind of arrangement between Russia and Ukraine. And as you know, since Trump has been coming back, he's constantly pushing for that, but obviously under his own conditions. What we can say about Trump's plan, and I took this, I think, from the Daily Mail, Trump's plan for bringing Putin and Zelensky to the negotiation table, and we see that sometimes it occurs that there are negotiations, but not yet between Putin and Zelensky, always between the ambassador of Trump, Steve Witkoff, and Putin, or between Ukrainian administrators and the Trump administration. What Trump has been suggesting comes down to a double deal where Zelensky and Ukraine would lose the territories that Russia now has, where there would be a promise that Ukraine would not be part of NATO, where the Americans might even withdraw, you see that here, from parts of Europe, including from the Baltic states, where NATO in Europe would be definitely severely weakened by the withdrawal of American troops. This was one of his election campaign promises, and where the Europeans might be brought in to be peacekeepers in a future kind of definition of the border between Russia and Ukraine. This is demanding a lot from Ukraine, namely giving up all the territory that Russia has occupied, giving up the strong guarantees that Russia would not occupy the rest of Ukraine and attack again. At the same time, as we know it already from Maduro, from Venezuela, from Iran, and also from Cuba, as I heard yesterday, Trump has been speculating about the end of the Cuban regime and demanded that the president of Cuba would go away, would leave Cuba, so that Cuba can be taken over by the Americans. I can do with it what I want, he said. So all of these instruments have to do with resources. And here as well, from the very beginning, Trump's position was there is a deal that also includes the access of the US companies to the mineral wealth of Ukraine. This is an iconic photo from the dispute that Trump and Zelensky had in the White House, where it almost crashed and where in the end Zelensky was, I could say, kicked out of the White House. At that point, obviously, Trump was nervous because Zelensky would not give up territory, And Zelensky would insist that you first make negotiations before giving up anything. The Russians will not give up anything. The Russians have not compromised on any of their maximalist demands that they set up in the very beginning, namely regime change, NATO out, demilitarization of a huge zone, and giving up of these territories, and reducing the number of the Ukrainian army soldiers, and so forth. So with other words, this is where we are. Here's a conflict, and there are many other conflicts coming up that are in various dangerous ways linked. For the last 5 minutes of this lesson, I want to bring you again to our two conflicting principles of international law. And I want to detect whether there is a line, a sequence of arguments, and I'm going back to yesterday's lecture about the wars that Putin waged and the arguments that he brought forward. Which of these two principles, self-determination or sovereignty, does Putin favor? The first war that he waged and with which he became known to the public was the Chechen War, and here he clearly supported the sovereignty argument, the sovereignty of Russia, and thereby its right to reintegrate a breakaway republic. At the same time, the NATO forces were bombing Serbia in order to stop the atrocious killing, mass murders of Albanians in Kosovo. At that time, Russia also supported the sovereignty of Serbia, saying NATO and other states have no right to interfere in the internal affairs of Serbia. And you might have heard that there's a special relationship between Serbia and Russia. The second major war in which Russia was involved also involved the principles of sovereignty and self-determination. And here Russia turned around and supported the self-determination of the South Ossetians and of the Abkhaz in Russia's own interpretation. In the war in Georgia, it protected the separatist republics in Georgia. So obviously, when the narrative doesn't fit anymore, the narrative is being changed, and the opposite argument is being made, namely here for the self-determination of the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians. Another escalation of this idea came in 2014 with the annexation. So not just the recognition of independent states that are breakaway states, but doing that with Crimea. So for a week or so, understanding this as an independent, recognizing it as an independent state, and then annexing it, then putting it into the Russian Federation and saying this is now our territory. So this is an escalation, a kind of second step after the takeover. And then the last escalation is obviously the escalation from annexing to war. Crimea was an annexation that was done without a war because the Russians took the peninsula by surprise. This did not function, this did not work well in the war. Here you see a map that is shown by Medvedev, former Russian prime minister, former Russian president, still a very important figure in the Russian security apparatus, showing us what the Russians would like to do with Ukraine, namely annexing most of it, leaving a little spot around Kiev, and being so gracious to give the western parts of Ukraine to Poland, to also foster Polish resentment against Ukraine. Yeah? This is obviously a very threatful scenario, a scenario of threat not only for the Ukrainians, but also for NATO, for the borderlands, that is especially the Baltic states that are bordering to Russia and to Belarus, but also for Poland. In Poland, you have across the line, whether you have right-wing or left-wing or center governments, much precaution and much preparation for the possibility of a Russian attack. And if you look at the Polish border, you see that there is a very small area between Poland and Königsberg, and that is Kaliningrad. That is the kind of the Suwałki corridor, which is connecting Poland and Lithuania. This is the weakest point in the eastern flank of NATO. So Poland and also other NATO states are doing their best in order to secure this border by bringing their own troops there. This is it for the Ukrainian war. I will now turn to something else, and I suggest that we first make a break of 15 minutes, and I hope to see you back in 15 minutes. Hi again. Thank you for coming back. The Russian narrative can easily be taken over by European leaders. And one example, the prime example, is Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary. And I want to briefly zoom in on his way of handling Hungary. The Eastern opening is an element that he introduced in the 2010s, and it meant that Hungary, after successful integration into the European Union, after being the main beneficiant of this integration in terms of economy, by making Hungary a very coveted area for investment, by setting up automobile industries in Hungary, especially from the European car factories, Hungary benefited a lot. But at the same time, Hungary wanted to counterweigh, to balance the European impact with the impact of Russia and China. So when Orban announced this Eastern opening in 2010, this was meant as a balancing act that would allow Hungary to be fully beneficiary of the European Union policies, but at the same time get the best out of China and Russia. This is also the time when China is on the rise and when the Europeans realize that China might also be something like a threat. 4 years later, he came with the slogan of illiberal democracy. Usually, we use the word liberal democracy to adhere to the idea that democracy is about freedom of speech, freedom of opinions, and about a cultivated exchange of opinions, thereby allowing minorities in a country to voice their opinion. Promoting the rights of minorities, whether that is ethnic minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. In an illiberal democracy, according to Orban, this is all not necessary because the state and the society will be governed by the majority. The democracy in this illiberal democracy means the rule of the majority and thereby the silencing of the minorities. And this is very popular among parts of the constituencies, especially in rural areas, who feel overwhelmed by globalization, by the confusing impact of the European Union, and by the loss of sovereignty as they feel it for Hungarians within the European Union. So that's the point when he starts leveraging the European Union in order to obtain more money and more support that he would need at home. I'm still focusing on Russia in this slide. Hungary is, of course, an Eastern partner in the European Union, and it is very much beneficent of Russian oil and gas, fueling the Hungarian industry. So the Hungarian industry that blossomed after the integration into the European Union was fueled by Russian oil and gas and created a dependence. The same for Germany, the same for Slovakia. Hungary, as closer to Russia and closer to Ukraine, of course, was more dependent on Russian oil and gas than, for instance, Germany. When Germany decided to withdraw from the Russian supply lines, it still had harbors, ports in the north to receive LNG, liquid gas, from other countries, from the US, from Norway, from Qatar, and so forth. For Hungary, as a landlocked country, this is much more difficult. At the same time, Hungary also fell into the Russian nuclear trap. Russia is exporting nuclear energy. Russia is using nuclear energy to a huge degree, also for powering its colonization of the Arctic, for instance. That is using nuclear energy to bring energy to areas where nothing else is possible. But Russia also exports nuclear energy, including, for instance, the setting up of nuclear power plants in Turkey or here in Bulgaria or in Hungary. This makes these countries depending on Russia's state agency for nuclear energy, Rosatom, for many, many decades, because building a nuclear power plant is one thing, takes decades, but then the supply lines would also come from Russia, which means the nuclear material is being brought to Hungary and then being shipped back to Russia for depositing. With other words, by setting up a power plant that is run by the Russians and being financed partially by the Russians, this country makes itself depending on the Russian policies. This depending on Russia, that is using Russia in order to counterbalance the European Union and still get the best from both of these worlds, goes hand in hand with the increase of authoritarianism in Hungary. And here I'm pretty outspoken about that. Hungary has introduced emergency bills that allow the government to rule over the parliament. With other words, the prime minister can do what he wants. He still has a comfortable majority in parliament, and he can rule over the parliament if the parliament is in doubt about that. You see here a picture of Orban with Trump in 2019. So people in the US have been very happy with Orban's behavior because it would undermine the European unity and thereby make it easier for the US to impose whatever kind of policies on the European Union. At the same time, this increase of authoritarianism at home has a clear gender ideology. I mentioned that in the context of what Putin is doing in Russia, the return to patriarchy, very misogynic kind of attitudes, and the full repression of gender minorities. The same is happening in Hungary. You still have a thriving community of LGBT people, but that's basically in Budapest. Budapest is a very liberal city, very free, and is defending the achievements of democracy and anti-corruption stride against the Orban regime. But in the countryside and in other cities, you have staunch majorities that would be against LGBTQ+ communities. And this is linked to statements like the corruption network that rules the entire Western world of politics and media must be eliminated. This is a slogan that says everything that you hear from the West, everything that you hear from liberal media must be eliminated because it's misleading our Hungarian population. So with other words, these media wars basically are at the core of human identity and human dignity as well. And gender ideologies also play out in the field of families. The idea that the body of the nation, the kind of living body that a nation is, needs reproduction, needs the enforcement of reproduction, and that of course means no homosexual marriages and more benefits to families with many children. This is the kind of positive turn that the government would give, namely support for families, while at the same time withdrawing support from other areas or even criminalizing other ways of living. Orban is a populist in the sense that he's constantly trying to get popular attention. He's constantly on the radio and on TV. He's, of course, controlling most of the media. But at the same time, he's not a populist in the sense that he would be anti-elitist. He's anti-elitist when it comes to what he calls Western elites. But in a country like Hungary, just like Putin in Russia, he's very much protecting the elite that came to power with him and that he protects. This state capture, as we call it, namely when a government, when a party, like his Fidesz party, is controlling the state, and the leader seems to be beyond doubt and beyond criticism, feeds from various narratives. Just like in the case of Putin, the narrative that Ukraine is just a runaway part of Russia, has to be brought back to Russia, has to be liberated. So for the Hungarians, there is still the cultivation of the trauma of Trianon. Trianon is one of the treaties after the First World War. The First World War brought an end to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, governed by Vienna, but in coalition with Budapest, where the Hungarian kingdom would encompass, as you see it here, not just what is today Hungary, but also most of Slovakia, parts of Romania, parts of Croatia, and so forth. With other words, there is always this idea that the Hungarians have been disadvantaged by the end of the First World War, and that the Hungarians have lost so many Hungarians living outside of Hungary, that are now citizens of other states, that there should be a constant agenda for getting these territories and these populations back. A kind of revanchism that Orban has been very, very well in fostering and mobilizing people with this idea, that the Hungarians are the losers of the European unification. He's not the only guy. There are many other European leaders of right-wing or even right and left-wing parties, because the two agendas can merge at one point, that go the same way and put the same kind of pressure on the European Union and try to boycott, for instance, the support for Ukraine. Fico is one of them, and what you also have, just like in Hungary, demonstrations against the government by crowds on the streets, especially students. You would see the same in Serbia against the Vučić government, and the same in Bratislava against the Fico government of Slovakia. With other words, that's something that you don't see in the media because it's very inconvenient. It's inconvenient to show that there are so many people in the streets in Serbia protesting against the government of Serbia, namely this one here, which is largely an ally of the European Union, and where the European Union is very committed to including Serbia into the European Union. But this is a reality in the days that we live. Serbia in particular is a dilemma for the European Union. On the one hand, you have Serbia as a state. On the other hand, you have the Bosnian Serb Republic, the Republika Srpska within Bosnia. Last week I told you about Bosnia being the construct that on the one hand preserves the boundaries of Bosnia as it was in Yugoslavia, so we keep the boundaries, but then you have the division between the two parts, the Bosnian Serb part and the Bosnian Muslim and Croat part. And the Bosnian Serb part is very unhappy with this and wants to unite with Serbia, blowing up this Dayton Agreement. And what both the leaders of Serbia and the leaders of the Bosnian part of Bosnia, the Serbian part of Bosnia do, is playing with the fire of separatism, namely of breaking up Bosnia-Herzegovina and thereby ending the Dayton Agreement and bringing this whole compromise situation to a standstill or to an explosion. On the one hand, the European Union wants to include the Western Balkans into the European Union, that is, make them candidates and bring them onto the path of convergence, that is, to make the legal systems, but also the rule of democracy, the rule of law in Serbia and in Bosnia-Herzegovina stable enough so that they can be attracted to the European Union. At the same time, you see that these governments are using our interest in the Western Balkans for promoting their own stances and repressing the opposition. You see that in Serbia, but you also see that in the Bosnian Serb Republic. So the European Union is making a kind of two-pronged approach. On the one hand, courting the leaders in order not to let Serbia completely move over to Russia's side, but at the same time also trying to augment pressure on these states to adhere to European norms. And this is a very difficult task. What is democratic backsliding? I'm now moving out of these examples of democratic backsliding. So after the Berlin Wall fell, we had the idea democracy would now be the natural outcome. And since the 2010s, we see this is not the case, especially in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Poland for a while. And then it's very difficult to move back to the state of democracy that you had before a reader monopolized power by taking over the state institutions, stuffing the institutions, the ministries with his own cronies, taking over the judiciary, the courts, and the media. Once you have them pocketed, it is very difficult to effect a democratic change of the regime. What will happen if a new person comes to power? Will he then reintroduce democracy, or she, or will they simply inherit the system of a democratic backsliding? Democratic regime moves towards autocracy and is becoming hybrid. An electoral autocracy is the word that we use for saying this is an autocracy ruled by somebody who doesn't tolerate dissent, but he is using elections in order to justify his rule by manipulating the elections and by not allowing contenders to run, and by controlling the media, he makes sure that he wins the elections. Diminishing democracy, the rule of law, and the transparency of the government. Transparency is very important so that civil society can control the government, that the parliament can control the government. But if the government has the control over the parliament and over the media, then this transparency is no longer demanded, and people are left in the dark about money flows, about where the resources go and who is the beneficient of state policies. There is less room for political participation, and these strongman policies, or these states have strong men on their top, at their top, who also express their personality as an asset to the country. Namely, they are the leaders of a nation that needs a leader. This literature on democratic backsliding goes as far as describing Hungary as a mafia state, as a state that is run by personal networks that include Orban, but also the major industrial entrepreneurs of the country. Clientelism is the word. Clientelism means that you have a patron, that is a leader, somebody who protects, and clients who use the services of the patron, but whom the patron can rely on. Clientelism is based not on the institutions of the state, not on the legal system, not on the constitutional framework, but on the personal relations and on the networks of acquaintances and friends and cronies. Corruption is high. If there is no transparency, then deals, including state procurements, are no longer controllable, and the friends of the government leaders usually profit from that. And it's usually fed by populism, that is by attitudes that reach out to the public and say, this is what you want to be. You want to be like me, basically, presenting himself as the embodiment of the nation. And of course, it's possibly supported by external players like Russia. At the same time, Hungary is part of the European Union. And the European Union Treaty says, once they became members of the European Union, all members of the European Union have to safeguard their democracy. The problem is, the European Union can control the state of democracy and rule of law at the beginning of the process when countries are being integrated, but then there is a very weak mechanism for making sure these countries do not fall back into autocracy. And this is exactly the case here. So the European Court of Justice has a difficult time in really putting Poland in the 2020s, but also Hungary, to responsibility about the state, the deplorable state of the judicial system and of the media repression. The European Union does that by withholding funds from Hungary. Hungary is not an anti-European country. There is no talk about moving out of the European Union, because everybody understands Hungary is benefiting not just from the regional funds and the development funds that come from the European Union, but simply by being connected to the major engines of the European Union, like Germany and Poland as well, but also Austria, for instance. So direct investments from these countries are much bigger than anything that would come from China or from Russia. But at the same time, the Hungarian regime can use China or Russia to counterbalance demands by the European Union and then veto things like support for Ukraine that we are again seeing at this time. The European Union has set aside 90 billion euros support for Ukraine over several years, and it has been prepared, and Hungary is vetoing that. It comes as a loan, so Ukraine would have to pay it back at the time. And usually this works, so usually this vetoing process by Hungary would make the European Union compromise on other accounts, that is releasing funds for Hungary, in spite of the violation of the democratic and human and legal system. But in this case, we're still in a limbo, not knowing where it's going to lead to. For Ukraine, a very deplorable situation. Hungary is also quarreling with Ukraine largely about the pipeline of gas that runs through Ukraine from Russia. Ukraine is not interested in having Russia being able to sell its gas and get money from the European Union, that is from Hungary in this case, for its gas. And Hungary wants to remain in charge of the industry, that is of the supply lines that come from Russia through Ukrainian territory. Over the past weeks, this has taken on very deplorable escalations. So, what's the features of this kind of regime? It's patronalism. You need a leader, a charismatic leader, a leader with the kind of outreach, the person that people would identify with. And then a very loyal kind of apparatus of people who depend on the leader or on the leader's party and thereby do what the party leadership wants. The state capture by the party, which meaning the state institutions, including universities and schools and the medical service, taken over by the party, so that you have your party offices everywhere, and there is less care for the well-being of the health service, of the infrastructure, of the roads, but the focus is on obedience and loyalty. And then the last point, these exclusionary identity politics that I mentioned in the beginning, namely by creating the idea that there is one identity that the regime, that the government defends, in this case, straight, white, Christian, Hungarian identity, with all the historical traumas that the regime still maintains, keeps alive in order to justify their positions towards the European Union. A collective identity that would go over individual rights, and that is exactly what illiberal democracy is supposed to mean, namely the majority outrules any rights of minorities. Majorities can ignore minority rights. And then there is a lot of revanchism, of these revenge attitudes, with people being called traitors to the nation, being called communists, which is almost equivalent to being traitor, being called feminists, so feminism becomes a bad word. The Central European University, which was one of the most prestigious universities set up in Budapest, has been kicked out of the country under a legal pretext, is now operating in Vienna. And that is because it was financed, or at least co-financed, by George Soros. So Soros is a Hungarian citizen who became wealthy in the 1990s and then used his wealth to support education and many other things. So liberal-minded institutions would simply be kicked out of the country. Gender studies no longer exists in Hungary. You simply stop studying gender studies. Gender studies is being replaced by a study that is something called family studies. So this means a direct intrusion into the university system and making universities docile. This comes under the pretext of the word sovereignty. Sovereignty is the kind of catchword for Brexit, but also for right-wing politicians all over the European Union, taking sovereignty back, not understanding that the European Union is a mechanism for providing the sovereignty of Europe and also thereby providing the sovereignty of the European member states on a global stage, but also in the negotiations within the European Union. And then on top of that comes xenophobia. And xenophobia first played out when Orban was prime minister, I believe, in the 2010s, and during the migration crisis, as we call it, the refugee crisis, when 1 million refugees came through the Balkan route, basically, through the land route. Many of them went through Hungary, and Hungary was the first to build up these fences to protect Hungary from the influx of people from the Middle East, or from Syria, from the Syrian war in that case. So the Orban regime at that time, and still, also feeds from the idea that it's protecting the poor Hungarians from the influx of migrants. Most of these migrants wanted to go to Germany, maybe to Austria, to the Netherlands, to other countries, to Britain, to the UK. This is still the case, so Hungary was not the final destination, but the fact that they would be going through Hungary and that the European Union wanted to come to an arrangement about the distribution of migrants, of refugees, let Orban use this kind of rhetoric foil, namely the migrants, as ammunition against Brussels. Today we again read headlines like this here, migrant crisis, how Europe went from Merkel's "we can do it," the German Chancellor said, yes, we can accommodate the influx of refugees, we're able to integrate them, to the closing of the fences that we saw first with Orban in the 2010s, and that today has been enforced by the European Union at large and by individual countries, of course, trying to source out the asylum procedures to countries in North Africa or even in Africa or in Albania or elsewhere. Yes, I think I can spare you this. We will have elections in Hungary on the 12th of April, and this is the first time that somebody else seems to be running ahead in the polls. So the conflict that Orban is having with Zelensky at this point, where Orban is making a point that he's standing for the interest of Hungary against the evil West and against the evil Zelensky and in support of Russia. This conflict must be seen against the campaigning that he's doing against his major rival, who is Peter Magyar, who is seemingly ahead in the polls and who attracts the Hungarian population, in spite of the fact that he doesn't have media superiority like Orban has. He's touring the country. He has been going through villages and towns and speaking on the streets in order to reach out to people. We cannot expect that he will relinquish whatever Hungarian attitudes there are, but we hope that he would be somebody who is doing away with the excesses of state capture and thereby making Hungary a normal state again, if you wish. If in the near future Hungary can turn back to what it was before. The crowds in Budapest at this point, you see them polarized. You see on one part of the city the crowds that are being bussed into Budapest pro-Orban, because the pro-Orban constituency is largely outside of Budapest, and on another part of the city you see the supporters of Peter Magyar. And for Peter Magyar, this is also about the European Union, about better relations to the West, and about support for the Ukrainian cause. This was something I wanted to bring to your attention because it's also something with a positive view on the horizon, with a positive strip of light. We have similar positive developments in other countries. In Poland, Poland also had a right-wing government that was state capturing, that was taking over the judiciary, that was putting the highest judges of the country into retirement to be able to replace them by party cronies. This has changed, or started to change, since 2024, when Donald Tusk became prime minister again. But still, in Poland, you also have a division between a president who is for the right-wing party, for the Peace Party, and the government of the conservatives, I would say, of this kind of middle ground party of Donald Tusk in the middle. The government being blocked by the president, who is still a supporter of the old regime. Similar stalemates we also have in other countries, but I now want to focus our attention at last on China and the Western Balkans. Let us talk about some countries that I didn't mention and some others that I did. This is the article that I gave you. The picture is already clear. This is from Corona Times. Thank you, Brother C. So this is saying thank you in Serbia to the Chinese supply of face masks. Russia and China did that in the beginning of the crisis as a symbolic act. So there were airplanes coming into Belgrade airport, and it was televised how beautiful it is that Russia provides the first Sputnik vaccines against the coronavirus. What was less told was that these were minimal amounts, that they were not safe, and that the Europeans were doing their best to produce a better vaccine and then to supply it to Serbia as well. With other words, there's a lot of symbolic policy, a lot of symbolic policy making in it, and of propaganda in relation to what China means to Serbia and to Hungary and to other states, and what is really done for these countries. Soyaltin Koleya says that the European Union policy towards the Balkan states, especially in the time of the war, has been very much focusing on security and on stabilizing the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans being those countries that you see here, including Serbia, but also Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and so forth, Macedonia. Stabilizing is, of course, very important, but stabilizing comes at the price that you stabilize regimes that are in power and that are not democratic, and that people are protesting against. So by stabilizing these regimes, you also betray the opposition, would be an argument coming from that opposition. You tolerate autocratic rulers, or you even support them by granting Serbia candidate status, for a good reason, because Serbia did hand over suspected war criminals to the ICTY that I talked about last year. But this means that Serbia is now in a privileged position, and the government can basically do whatever they want, especially if they counterbalance European demands for democracy and the rule of law with Russian influence. What's the role of China in all of this? Does China, like Russia, stabilize the autocracies in Eastern and Southeastern Europe? China has been on the rise, and this is a fantastic story about the economic development of China under a communist party. Being a communist-run state with a state capitalism that is going through the roof, especially in these years here, enormous growth rates that produce a surplus of money, the money that needs to be invested where it makes benefit, where it produces more money. So this would be, for instance, the European, but also the American industries, where you would get Chinese shareholders, but producing also for the export of Chinese goods. Here, of course, China is very effective in green energy, in the production of electric cars, which the European car manufacturers have largely ignored, overslept, or simply were too arrogant to make use of. So overcapacities in China need an outlet. And this outlet is, on the one hand, foreign direct investment, so money that is being invested in the European Union, for example. And here you see that the major beneficiaries of direct investment by China are not the Balkan states. It's not Poland, it's not Hungary, but it's largely the big industrial core countries of the European Union. Germany, the UK, of course, France and Italy. This is foreign direct investment, which means that, for instance, the ports of Rotterdam have Chinese stakeholders, a Chinese company, for producing, of course, the outlets, the inlets, the doorway to Chinese goods that would be handled by the port of Rotterdam or the port of Piraeus or elsewhere. At the same time, we see that the rulers in China, and that is Xi Jinping, is enforcing his autocracy. You would say in a communist party, isn't this a one-man party anyways, as we know it from Stalin? No. In China, you have always had, since Mao's death, a small circle of rulers. You would have one figurehead, but there is a kind of collegial rule in the Communist Party to make sure that there are no longer the same excesses that China had under Mao. Mao Zedong, he killed 20 or whatever million of his own population in a very crazy industrialization strife and in the terror against his own population. In order to not allow that, collegial kind of rule of the Communist Party in China. This doesn't mean democracy, it just means that responsibility lies on the shoulders of the elderly and experienced leaders. What Xi Jinping has been doing is doing away with these elderly persons in the Chinese Central Committee to have complete rule, to be not bound by older authorities that might not be in line with his agenda. So what he has is enlarged powers and, of course, projecting that power also onto the world. Keep in mind, China, 1.4 billion inhabitants. That's 10 times more than Russia. Lots of regions. China is not a unitary state, but has Tibet, for instance. As you know, there is a free Tibet movement in the West. Xinjiang, which is eastern Turkestan, originally inhabited by Turkic-speaking nations, now largely colonized by Chinese people. And there is still the question of Taiwan. Taiwan is recognized as a breakaway area of China, but at the same time, China is enforcing upon the West the policy to only recognize China. Of course, we deal with Taiwan, and Taiwan is a very important provider of microchips for the European Union and for the US. But at the same time, all of our countries have decided, our states have decided to focus on China and to not recognize Taiwan as an independent state. With other words, Taiwan is in a very dire situation in front of the gigantic powerhouse that is China. In order to create an outlet for its surplus production, that is for its industrial production, which is no longer just radios and television sets, but computers and high-tech, China is developing the Belt and Road Initiative. This Belt and Road Initiative means that Chinese money is being used to build roads, railways, but also harbors, ports, as the infrastructure that is needed for Chinese companies to export their goods all over the world. And here you see the major lines of communication that are kept in mind from China here. Of course, for the West it's important, but also more important even for Africa and for the Middle East. China has been making great inroads into the economies of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, for instance, where China is dominating the economy by direct investment, but also simply by selling their own goods to these countries. And for Russia, just going back to Russia in a second, this is a very difficult kind of thing to swallow because China is also expelling Russia from these markets, not just European companies and American companies, but also Russian companies. So China is expanding its outreach, but they do that in an economic network in this Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, the more is invested in another country, the more China also has leverage on these other countries, the more it can shape the policies of these countries. Take into consideration some Pacific islands. So they would first get a hospital built on Chinese money. They would then get a Chinese embassy, and then they would again get a Chinese port. This can be revolutionary for the Solomon Islands that I'm talking about, because they had been very much neglected. They're in a very poor state, and they want development. But of course, such Chinese investment comes with strings attached, namely, there would now be Chinese control over the import-export, or over the military, over the security of these islands. The Solomon Islands are very small, but the same kind of procedures are also at work in other states. Vietnam, Cambodia, and that kind of stuff, so East Asian states, but also parts of Europe, including the Western Balkans in the first place, that are weak enough to allow that. This is just to show you the countries in the world that by 2025 have agreed to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, signing memoranda of understanding with China, and thereby allowing China to invest in their countries for deals. This would be, you see, Africa is big there. So China comes with money and says, we are building a hospital and we're building an airport, we're building the infrastructure if you give us this mine for exploitation. So rare earth in China, in Africa, are more and more, that is minerals, are more and more in the hands of Chinese companies that come in packages. The package is, here is the Chinese company, Chinese workers, Chinese money, and they're being employed to develop this infrastructure project, which is good for the government of the host country, say Burundi. But it also means that Burundi loses the sovereignty over this mine, and it might get taxes from the income produced by this nickel mine, but the nickel would go to China, which is a big problem for us and also for our car industries, because we need the rare earth, but China is already monopolizing the production and export of rare earth from China, from Asia, and from huge parts of Africa. You see, the Europeans are a blank spot here. The European Union and North America is not part of the Belt and Road, because for us, this is a threat. You see that Poland is still there, Hungary as well, so the Western Balkan states all have their agreements, but the western countries of the European Union would beware of that and saying, we don't want Chinese influence. Chinese influence is always feared to come with surveillance. That has to do with companies like Huawei that produced mobile phones that will be giving data to Chinese companies. Electric cars might be giving data to Chinese companies, and all that leads to a surveillance of European citizens by Chinese, also by the Chinese intelligence services, of course, and it could lead to huge problems in the future. In countries like Serbia, Chinese intelligence officers already have their contact points where they control Chinese immigrants, Chinese laborers, and Chinese entrepreneurs in Serbia. So it also leads, also in Hungary, it leads to a presence of Chinese intelligence officers to control the Chinese diaspora in these countries. With other words, it comes as a beneficial promise. The Chinese say, we benefit from it and you benefit from it. We have the money and you don't. You have the minerals, we don't. Chinese would say, we have been a downtrodden country on this earth, just like you. We have been colonized by the British, by the Germans, by the French, and you name it, by the Japanese, of course. Therefore, we are just a decolonizing country like you are. This might have held true for the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, but it's no longer true for the 2020s. China is not a post-colonial state, it's a state that is developing its own colonial networks with the help of its enormous industrial and financial output. At the same time, just linking back to Russia, Russia's economy is dwarfed by China. Yeah, Russia once was, the Soviet Union once was the big brother of China and helping China to industrialize in the beginning. And China has been taken over and the Russian economy is weak compared to China. What Russia still has is weapons, and the nuclear weapons, of course. But what Russia also has is control over this huge Arctic line. And you see here the map from the North Pole again. Today, not talking about Greenland, but about the ways how China wants to export its goods to Russia, but also to the European Union. You see, the straight way is via the North Pole route. And as global warming is continuing, there will be no ice shields in the summer and secure routes, and maybe even in the wintertime in certain areas. For Russia, this means that it's building up the infrastructure of the Arctic shoreline to have emergency stations there, that is, if a ship is in distress, to have control over the flows of goods, and to take tariffs for the use of the Russian waters. With other words, here China is using Russia not just as a supplier of oil and gas and coal. Russia is also exporting lots of dirty coal to China, but also with the prospect of a warmer century in which the Russian Arctic will be the most important lifeline of the world between China and Europe and between China and the US. For the US, you see, of course, it would be very attractive to have an alternative line that would go via Alaska and Canada and then Greenland again. So this is why Greenland might also play a role in these games here. Is China an opportunity? It is certainly an opportunity for countries that have been ignored and neglected by the West. And here I'm talking about several African countries that have a history of French colonialism and where the French companies have exploited the natural resources without much infrastructure investments. These countries have largely turned into military regimes. I'm talking about Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and some others, and are now having a very anti-French and anti-European policy. Military leaders want to stay in power, and they want to be supported by money streams, which they know to maintain their militias. This comes from China. China is tapping into countries like these in the Sahel zone with infrastructure and energy projects to make them dependent on China. Loans and projects come in one package. So here's the project, here's the construction site, and at the same time, China also gives them money for constructing this. And we see that this is outbidding then the European Union. I will move forward one thing quickly to the example of the Greek port of Piraeus, of Athens. Just an example. The Greek port, and a huge chunk of this port is in the hands of China, which means China uses Greece as the entry gate from the Suez Canal to the parts of southeastern Europe and then further on to the west, to Germany and to the Netherlands. Some of these piers have been leased, some have been constructed by China. The port itself has been blossoming since the direct investment of China. And from the port, China has been constructing or has been supporting the regimes of these countries, the governments of these countries, to build a new railway, to improve the railway communication between Piraeus in Athens and then Budapest. And when we look at the projects for building, for rebuilding, refurbishing the old and corrupted railway lines there, we see that the Chinese banks are important in giving the loans to these countries. So this is the Hungary and Serbia packages coming from the Chimex Bank, from the Chinese Export Bank, as in the form of loans. Loans being given, loans means they have to be paid back, which means the manufactured railway has to be efficient to produce the wealth so that the loans can be paid back. This is the string attached. The loans come with a Chinese bank and therefore also according to Chinese legal systems. And what we get then is here, and this is the example, in Hungary, is that the contract for this railroad building would be going to the people who are close to the government. In this case, obviously, Hungary's richest tycoon, Lorenz Mészáros, a friend of Orban, who is benefiting from this influx of money from China. So loans taken by the government, where the government is guaranteeing the loans, go then into the infrastructure projects that are produced by the cronies of the regime. The expulsion of the European University, I already mentioned, from the Central European University, all liberal academies being eliminated, and at the same time there are plans for creating a Chinese university campus, of Fudan University in Budapest. This just to keep in mind. There are several other projects that the Chinese have been building, including a highway line in Montenegro. Montenegro, bordering Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, and Serbia, you see here, is not directly on this Belt and Road Initiative. We're talking here about a highway that is being built east-west to unite the ports of Montenegro, especially Bar, with Serbia. So improving the infrastructure of Montenegro and keeping the country together. This has been a pet project of the government, of Milutinovic, for many, many years. So it's a project that has nothing to do with the economic system of the Chinese at this point, with the Belt and Road Initiative. But it comes with the same kind of mechanism, namely giving Chinese loans for allowing Chinese companies to build railways or highways. The highway is still in a very atrocious situation. Obviously, much is simply ineffective. The European Union checked whether it's feasible to do these bridges and tunnels, and whether the money being spent on them can be won back by the achievements by the business, by taking tariffs of the people who use them. But then the European Union said this is impossible to do and it's not feasible. And then the Chinese came in and the regime of Djukanovic approved that. With other words, Montenegro now has a gigantic construction site that is almost not usable, not completed, and at the same time has huge loans to pay back to China for a project that was carried out by Chinese companies, benefiting Chinese workers and Chinese tycoons in China. This is the story where we are. I try to link most of the current events that are going on in the world with the core part of our curriculum, which focused on the international law concerning Yugoslavia and the Ukraine war. But I hope that from this kind of linking of many different conflicts, we see how European studies is a crucial discipline for bringing us to an understanding of global relations, not just of European relations, global relations, and how much the European Union itself is conditioned by the outside players, whether that's the US or Russia. Trump is not formally part of this program, but he has been appearing all of the time because obviously we are living in this time of a complete turn, and we will be looking back at the years since 22 with the idea that old securities have been gone. And that also means old securities about the role of the European Union. What I'm telling you is not just that we have a East European section and a East European minor and master in this program, but that you should be careful about disinformation that you get. Check all your sources. I gave you academic articles to back the knowledge that you had about all these events already from the news. And the most important thing is stay confident. Thank you very much. Yay! Good. Stay in school.